In the spring of 1864, Union soldiers moving through Burke County, Georgia, documented something they would never fully explain. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a victory. It was a discovery, one so unsettling that even seasoned men hesitated to describe it in detail. Hidden beneath the remains of a plantation known as Thornhill Estate, they found a sealed cellar. The doors were iron, reinforced from the outside. No windows, no light, no sound coming from within. When those doors were finally forced open, the smell reached them first. Then came the silence, and then the children, 23 of them. They were huddled together in the darkness, shielding their eyes from the sudden light. Some were barely 4 years old. The oldest looked no more than 13. But what disturbed the soldiers most wasn't just their condition. It was how similar they looked. The same pale green eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, auburn hair that seemed almost unnatural in its uniformity. It didn't look like coincidence. It looked intentional. One soldier would later write that it felt like staring at the same child over and over again, as if they were copies of a single design. When questioned, the eldest girl spoke calmly, her voice steady in a way that felt rehearsed. "She says we belong here," she told them. "She says we are her legacy." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances and asked the only question that mattered. "Who?" The girl didn't hesitate. "Our mother." That was the first and last time the name Katherine Thornhill appeared in an official record. The report was marked confidential, filed away, forgotten. Local histories of Burke County make no mention of Thornhill Estate. No plantation, no owner, no trace of the family that lived there. It was as if the entire place had been erased. But it existed, and what happened there was very real. To understand how those children ended up locked beneath that house, you have to go back nearly 20 years earlier, to a winter morning in 1847, the day Katherine Thornhill became a widow, and the day something far darker quietly began. The winter of 1847 settled over Burke County like a quiet warning no one understood at the time. Frost clinging to the red clay fields of Thornhill Estate as the once profitable plantation stood on the edge of collapse, burdened by debt, neglect, and the recent death of its owner, leaving Katherine Thornhill with a future that seemed already written by others. Neighbors expected her to fail, a young widow without strong support, surrounded by creditors who waited patiently for her downfall, convinced the estate would soon be sold and forgotten like so many others before it. But Katherine was not the kind of woman who accepted ending so easily, and while the world around her prepared for her surrender, she began working in silence, spending long nights in her dimly lit study surrounded by ledgers, unpaid bills, and land records, calculating every possible outcome, only to arrive again and again at the same unavoidable truth that traditional methods would not save her. Selling the estate meant survival but also humiliation, while keeping it required something no one else had considered. And it was during those sleepless nights, as candlelight flickered across her face and shadows stretched across the walls, that a different kind of idea began forming. At first vague and unspoken, something she almost resisted acknowledging. But the more she examined it, the more it transformed from a thought into a plan, because everything in her world depended on labor. And labor, she realized, did not have to be purchased if it could be created. And once that realization took hold, it changed the way she saw everything around her. No longer observing people as individuals but as factors: strength, health, endurance, age, watching quietly as they moved through their daily routines, noting patterns, differences, and possibilities, until those observations became calculations. She began recording in secret, developing a coded system that disguised her intentions behind ordinary agricultural language, words like planting, yield, and stock, masking something far more deliberate beneath the surface. Pages that would appear harmless to anyone else but carried the blueprint of something deeply unsettling. And by the time spring arrived, Katherine Thornhill had made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would rebuild Thornhill Estate not through trade, negotiation, or chance, but through absolute control, a system designed to sustain itself, generation after generation. And the first step of that plan came so quietly that no one on the plantation understood its meaning. At the time, not yet, but years later, when the truth finally surfaced, that moment would be remembered not as an act of survival, but as the beginning of something far darker than failure itself. The first step of Katherine's plan began so quietly that it barely disturbed the routine of Thornhill Estate, because once she crossed that line, everything that followed became inevitable. And in the early spring of 1847, as the air warmed and the fields prepared for planting, she selected the first man not with emotion but with calculation, choosing based on strength, endurance, and what she believed would produce the most desirable outcome, reducing a human life to a set of traits written neatly into her coded journal. And when she summoned him to the main house after dark, there was no explanation given, no context, only an order that could not be refused, because refusal in that world carried consequences no one dared to test. And what happened that night was recorded later in her ledger with chilling simplicity, disguised beneath neutral language that masked the true nature of her actions. A single line that turned something deeply human into something mechanical, something planned, something controlled. And in the weeks that followed, Katherine continued as if nothing had changed, maintaining her composed presence during the day, while at night she returned to her study, documenting, observing, refining, until the first signs of success began to appear. And when she realized her plan was working, it did not bring relief or hesitation, only confirmation that she had been right, that her solution was not only possible but effective. And from that moment forward, she stopped questioning herself entirely, because doubt had no place in what she was building. And as her confidence grew, so did the scale of her thinking, expanding beyond a single outcome into something far more structured, more deliberate, mapping out possibilities that stretched years into the future, imagining a system that would sustain itself without reliance on outside forces, a closed cycle where everything began and ended within the boundaries of her control. And she began to refine her methods, recording details others would never notice, physical changes, timelines, patterns, writing everything in her coded language so that even if the pages were discovered, the truth would remain hidden beneath layers of interpretation. But not everyone on the plantation remained unaware, because subtle changes began to ripple through the estate, unexplained summons, shifts in behavior, a tension that couldn't be named but could be felt. And though no one spoke openly about it, a quiet unease settled into the rhythm of daily life, as if something had changed in a way that could not yet be understood. And by the time the first undeniable result of Katherine's plan became visible, it was already too late to question where it had begun, because what had started as a desperate solution to save a failing plantation had already transformed into something far more controlled, far more intentional, and far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. By the time the first child was born, Thornhill Estate had already begun to change in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore, because what should have been a private event quietly folded into Plantation. Life instead became something that Katherine treated with calculated attention, documenting every detail with the same precision she once reserved for failing accounts and crop yields, noting the timing, the condition, the physical traits, as if the child were not a human life but the result of an experiment she intended to refine. And while outwardly she maintained the image of a composed widow managing her estate with discipline and control, behind closed doors she expanded her records, adding new symbols, new patterns, turning her coded journal into something far more structured, a system that tracked not just outcomes but potential. Because to Katherine this was no longer about survival alone, it was about proving that her method worked. And once that belief took hold, she moved forward without hesitation, selecting again, repeating the process with increasing confidence, each decision colder than the last, until what had once been an unthinkable act became routine. Within the hidden structure of her plan, and as the months passed, the presence of the child began to raise quiet questions across the estate, whispers that traveled through the quarters in fragments and glances, because the explanation Katherine provided never fully settled the unease. And though no one dared to confront her directly, there was a growing awareness that something was not right, something that could not be named but lingered in the air like a shadow, just out of sight. And at the same time, Katherine's behavior became more controlled, more deliberate, isolating certain parts of the estate from others, limiting access, restricting movement, ensuring that her work remained hidden beneath layers of normalcy. But secrecy has a way of creating its own pressure, and the more she tried to contain it, the more it began to leak through small, unnoticed cracks. A look held too long, A question left unanswered, a pattern that didn't quite align with what people expected, and though no one yet understood the full extent of what she was building, the foundation was already in place. Because Katherine Thornhill had moved beyond desperation into something far more dangerous, a system that no longer depended on chance or circumstance, but on control so absolute that it began to reshape everything around it. And from that point forward, Thornhill Estate was no longer just a plantation struggling to survive. It had become something else entirely, something that existed in silence hidden behind routine, growing slowly, deliberately, and waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. As the months turned into years, what Katherine had started in secrecy began evolving into something far more structured, almost methodical in a way that removed any trace of hesitation or doubt. Because by now she no longer saw her actions as desperate measures, but as a system that was proving itself. With each passing season, and with every new child born under her control, she expanded her records, refining her coded language into something more precise, more organized, turning scattered notes into calculated patterns that mapped not just the present but the future. And the plantation itself slowly began reflecting these hidden changes, though to outsiders, it appeared as if Thornhill Estate was simply recovering from decline, becoming more stable, more efficient, even slightly prosperous again, while in reality, the source of that stability was something no visitor could have imagined, a carefully controlled cycle that existed entirely within Katherine's design, and she became increasingly deliberate in how she managed everything, separating roles, controlling interactions, ensuring that every action aligned with her long-term vision. And those who lived on the plantation began to feel this shift even if they could not fully understand it. Because routines became stricter, movements more restricted, and certain decisions began to follow patterns that felt unnatural, as if outcomes were being decided long before events actually occurred. And the children themselves, though still too young to question their world, were already being placed within that structure, observed not as individuals but as parts of something larger, something that extended beyond their own lives. And Katherine watched them closely, noting differences, tracking growth, measuring outcomes against her expectations, adjusting her approach where needed, because for her this was no longer an experiment. It was a process she intended to perfect, and with each passing year, her confidence hardened into certainty, a belief that what she was building could not fail because it was no longer dependent on chance. And yet beneath that control, something else was beginning to form, something quieter but just as powerful, because systems built in silence often carry within them the seeds of resistance. And though Katherine believed she had accounted for everything, she had overlooked one thing she could never fully control: the thoughts and awareness of those living within her design. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that awareness was beginning to grow, waiting for the moment when it would no longer remain silent. What Katherine failed to understand was that control, no matter how precise, can never remain absolute when it is built upon human lives, because beneath the structure she had created, beneath the routines and patterns she believed were perfectly aligned, something far less predictable was taking shape. And it began not with rebellion, but with awareness, small, quiet realizations that passed between individuals in silence, in glances, in moments where something did not feel right, because even without knowing the full truth, those living within her system could sense that their lives were being shaped by forces they did not choose. And that realization, once it begins, does not disappear, it grows, slowly but steadily. And Katherine, so focused on refining her process, failed to recognize that the very thing she had tried to eliminate, uncertainty, was returning in a different form, not in her records or her calculations, but in the minds of those around her. And among the children, this change was even more subtle, because they had been raised within her system, taught to accept it as normal. Yet even they began to notice differences, questions forming without clear answers. Why certain people were treated differently, why some were separated while others were brought closer, why their lives seemed to follow paths already decided before they had the chance to understand them. And these questions did not lead immediately to defiance, but they created something far more dangerous: curiosity, because curiosity does not obey rules. It does not remain contained, and once it begins, it seeks answers regardless of the consequences. And it was within this growing curiosity that the first real crack in Katherine's system appeared. though she did not see it at the time, because from her perspective everything was still functioning exactly as planned. The estate was stable, her records were expanding, her outcomes were consistent, and yet beneath that surface, the foundation was beginning to shift, because the people she believed she had, reduced to variables, were beginning to think, to question, to observe in ways she had never accounted for. And in that quiet, unseen space between control and awareness, the future of Thornhill Estate was already beginning to change, moving slowly but inevitably toward a moment when the system Katherine had built would face something it had never been designed to withstand: the will of those who lived inside it. By the late 1850s, Thornhill Estate had transformed into something that, to an outsider, appeared almost remarkable, because where once there had been decline, there was now order. Where there had been instability, there was now consistency, and Katherine Thornhill had gained a quiet reputation as a woman who had somehow managed to restore what should have been lost. Yet no one outside the estate understood the true nature of that transformation, because the system she had created operated beneath visibility, hidden within routines that appeared ordinary but were anything but. And as her confidence grew, so did the scale of her ambition. No longer limited to maintaining what she had, she began planning for what would come decades ahead, mapping out futures for people who were still children, assigning roles, imagining outcomes, constructing a lineage that existed entirely within her design. And it was during this time that she created a space within the house that reflected the full extent of her thinking. A private room where her records were no longer just notes but an archive, a place where every detail of her system was preserved, organized, and expanded. A space that no one else was allowed to enter, because within it existed the truth of what Thornhill Estate had become. And Katherine spent hours there, reviewing, adjusting, refining, convinced that she was building something that could not be undone, something that would continue long after she was gone. And yet outside that room, the world itself was beginning to change, tensions rising across the country, conflicts growing louder, whispers of war spreading even into places as isolated as Burke County. And though Katherine paid little attention to these developments at first, believing her system existed apart from such uncertainties, she failed to recognize that no system, no matter how controlled, exists outside the influence of the world beyond it. And as the first signs of that change began to reach Thornhill Estate, carried through rumors, through travelers, through fragments of news that could not be ignored, the balance she had worked so carefully to maintain began to shift, because what was coming was larger than her plans, larger than her control, and for the first time since she had begun, there was something on the horizon that she could not predict. By early 1863, the world beyond Thornhill Estate could no longer be ignored, because the distant conflict that had once seemed like something happening far away had begun to press closer, carried in fragments of conversation, in the tension of passing travelers, in the uneasy silence that followed every mention of the war, and even within the isolation Katherine had carefully maintained. Those fragments found their way inside, shaping thoughts, creating questions, unsettling the fragile balance she had worked so hard to preserve. Because for the first time, there existed a force beyond her control that could not be contained within her records or predicted through her calculations. And while she continued to act as though nothing had changed, insisting on routine, reinforcing discipline, and tightening her oversight of every movement within the estate, the people around her were beginning to sense that the structure she had built was not as unbreakable as it once appeared, and that realization spread quietly, not as open resistance but as something more dangerous, a shared awareness that something larger was coming, something that might alter everything. And among the older children, this awareness deepened into something more complex, because now they understood both the system they were part of and the possibility, however uncertain, that it might not last forever, and that possibility created a tension within them, a conflict between fear of the unknown and the growing desire for something beyond what they had always been told was their only reality. And Katherine saw the change, even if she could not fully understand it, noticing the subtle shifts in behavior, the hesitation in obedience, the way silence now carried meaning where once it had carried none. And this unsettled her more than anything else, because it was not something she could confront directly, not something she could measure or correct, and so she responded in the only way she knew how, by increasing control, by reinforcing the boundaries she had created, by ensuring that every aspect of life within Thornhill Estate remained structured and predictable, believing that if she could maintain order long enough, whatever was happening beyond her world would pass without consequence. But she was wrong, because the war was not something that would simply pass. It was something that would arrive, and when it did, it would not just challenge her system, it would expose it. And the moment that exposure began, everything she had built would be forced into the open, whether she was ready for it or not. The arrival of soldiers in Burke County did not come with the thunder of battle at first, but with something quieter and far more unsettling. The slow movement of men, the presence of uniforms that did not belong to the land, and the realization that the war Katherine had tried to ignore was now close enough to touch. And though Thornhill Estate remained physically untouched in those early days, its isolation was broken in a way that could not be reversed, because once the outside world steps into a closed system, even briefly it leaves something behind, an awareness, a shift, a disruption that cannot be undone, and the people on the estate felt it immediately, not just in what they saw but in what they heard, fragments of conversations carried across distance, words like freedom, like union, like change, words that held meaning even when they were not fully understood, and those words began to settle into the minds of those who had lived their entire lives within boundaries they had never been allowed to question, creating something fragile but powerful, a sense that what existed might not be permanent. And Katherine sensed this change with growing unease, because for the first time, her authority felt challenged not by action but by possibility. And possibility is far more difficult to control than behavior, because it exists in thought and imagination, in the quiet spaces where rules have no reach. And so she responded with increasing urgency, tightening restrictions, limiting movement, reinforcing routines, attempting to contain something that was already spreading beyond her grasp. And yet even as she did this, the presence of the war continued to press closer, not in a single moment of impact, but in a series of small, accumulating changes that made it impossible to pretend that Thornhill Estate existed apart from the world beyond it. And among the older children, this shift became impossible to ignore, because now they could see clearly that the system they had been raised within was not the only reality, that there were other forces, other structures, other possibilities beyond what they had been taught. And once that realization took hold, it began to change the way they saw everything, not immediately, not openly, but steadily, quietly, in ways that Katherine could sense but could not fully understand, because the control she had built depended on certainty, and certainty was beginning to disappear. By the time the war had fully tightened its grip on Georgia, Thornhill Estate was no longer a place of quiet control but a space filled with tension that could be felt in every movement, every glance, every silence that stretched just a little too long, because what Katherine had built over years was now being pressed from two sides at once. From the outside by a collapsing world she could not stop, and from the inside by people who were no longer willing to remain exactly as she had shaped them. And this convergence created something unstable, something inevitable, because systems like hers do not simply fade, they break, and the signs of that break were already appearing. Not in open defiance, but in hesitation, in the subtle refusal to fully comply, in the way instructions were followed but without the same certainty as before. And Katherine, who had always relied on precision, began to feel something she had not allowed herself before. Uncertainty, because for the first time, she could not predict what would happen next. And that loss of predictability unsettled her more than any external threat, because it meant that the system she believed was perfectly controlled had variables she could no longer manage. And among the older children, this shift was even more pronounced, because now they existed in a space between two realities, one defined by everything they had been taught, and another defined by what they were beginning to understand for themselves, and that conflict could not remain unresolved. Because once a person begins to see beyond the limits placed on them, they cannot fully return to ignorance, and this created a quiet alignment among them. Not planned, not spoken openly, but present, a shared awareness that something had to change, even if they did not yet know how or when it would happen, and Katherine sensed this alignment without being able to define it, which made it even more dangerous in her eyes, because she could not confront what she could not clearly see, and so she began to act with greater intensity, reinforcing her authority, reminding everyone of the structure she had created, attempting to restore the certainty that was slipping away. But in doing so, she only accelerated what was already unfolding, because pressure does not eliminate instability, it amplifies it, and as the war continued to move closer, as the outside world edged nearer to Thornhill Estate with every passing week, the fragile balance that had held everything together for so long was reaching its limit, and the moment when it would finally give way was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching steadily and irreversibly. The night after Katherine revealed her final plan, Thornhill Estate no longer felt like a place. It felt like something waiting to collapse under its own weight. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with unspoken decisions. No one slept. In the quarters, whispers moved like wind through dry leaves, quiet but constant, carrying one idea from person to person: this cannot continue. Inside the main house, Eleanor sat awake, staring into darkness, her mind racing through everything she had learned, everything she had been forced to accept. For years she had lived in comfort compared to the others, told she was chosen, protected, special. Now she understood the truth. She wasn't protected, she was prepared. Prepared to become the next link in a chain that would never end unless someone broke it. Across the hall, Jonathan stood at the window, watching the distant tree line, his reflection faint in the glass. The beliefs he had held onto for so long were cracking piece by piece, replaced by something far more dangerous: clarity. By dawn, the tension had reached a breaking point. It didn't begin with shouting or violence. It began with stillness, the kind of stillness that comes just before something irreversible happens. Katherine moved through the house as if nothing had changed, issuing quiet instructions, maintaining control through routine. But control, once questioned, never returns the same. When she stepped outside that morning, she noticed it immediately. The silence. No movement in the fields. No voices from the quarters. Just dozens of eyes watching, waiting. For the first time in 16 years, Katherine Thornhill was not the one in control of what came next. Eleanor stepped forward, not as a child, not as a product of Katherine's design, but as something entirely unexpected, someone who understood the system well enough to end it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "It stops today," she said. And in that moment, the invisible structure Katherine had built, the fear, the obedience, the illusion of power began to collapse. Not loudly, not suddenly, but completely. What happened next was never fully written down, but its weight carried far beyond that morning. The silence didn't shatter, it shifted, slowly, deliberately, like something long buried finally pushing to the surface. No orders were given, yet movement began. One step, then another. People who had spent years being directed now acted on their own will, and that quiet change was more powerful than any act of force. Katherine remained on the porch watching it unfold, her control dissolving not through resistance, but through absence of obedience. She tried to speak, to gather authority back into her voice, but it no longer held meaning. The structure she had built, carefully, coldly, over 16 years, was no longer recognized by those within it. Eleanor stood firm, no longer a piece of that structure, but the one who understood it well enough to step outside it. Jonathan, once the most loyal, no longer defended it. And in that moment, Katherine faced something she had never prepared for. Not rebellion, but independence. There are no complete records of what followed, only fragments shaped by memory and silence. Some accounts suggest she attempted to leave, moving quickly across the yard as if distance alone could restore control. Others say she remained where she stood, unable to accept that the system she created had ended without her consent. What is known is simple. By nightfall, Katherine Thornhill was gone. No formal report explained it. No investigation pursued it. Just a disappearance that settled into the land like a secret no one intended to uncover. And in many ways, that absence became the final chapter of her story. In the days that followed, Thornhill Estate transformed in ways that could not be reversed. Doors once sealed were opened. Spaces once hidden were left exposed to light and air. The cellar, once a place of confinement, stood empty, not reclaimed, just abandoned. And the children, those who had lived in darkness, began to step into something uncertain but entirely new. Freedom did not arrive as safety or clarity. It arrived as choice, and choice carried its own weight. But it was theirs. When Union soldiers later documented the estate, They recorded only pieces, enough to unsettle, not enough to explain. A brief mention. A guarded letter. A detail filed away and forgotten among countless others. Thornhill Estate disappeared from official history, but not from memory, because some stories do not rely on records to survive. They live in what they reveal about power, about control, and about what happens when silence is finally broken. And perhaps that is where this story truly ends. Not in the disappearance of one woman, but in the moment her system stopped being obeyed. Because sometimes history does not record justice clearly. Sometimes it leaves only the outcome, and lets silence explain the rest.